Hey, welcome to the monthly wrap up of Holly McKay's Substack. Let us go over some of the stories that appeared on a Substack this month and get Holly's aftertake on these things. Holly, let's start off with Laos. And you published a story about this, but the core of the story was about cluster bombs. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the issue of Laos, I think most people you talk to will be really surprised to learn that during the Vietnam War, there was this shadow war that was happening in Laos. And just so many bombs were being dropped on that country. And I believe it's still the most heavily mined country in the world today, all these years later. And farmers and children, and often very poor people, are losing their lives, they're losing their limbs, they're losing their eyesight because they are treading on these cluster munitions, which tend to look very much sort of like toys. So they're very appealing to children. And these were actually dropped in a very sort of secret CIA war during Vietnam in a bid to sort of stop soldiers from coming across and using that water. But the public didn't know about it for many years later. And it really still hasn't become ingrained in history. So I think when I talk to people about this, they're really unaware about this, I guess, very grim part of US history. And that's still going on today. And it took such a long time to acknowledge these bombs, let alone sort of help with the cleanup process. I think for decades, the US was really barely giving Laos anything to kind of mitigate this. And it's only been kind of in recent years, and I think President Obama really stepped it up, was to give them a lot more money and a lot more assistance in clearing these mines. But even that is really just a Sisyphean task because it is just so covered. So it's really awful. And so I think many of us are also quite aware of how awful cluster munitions are. So basically, you have sort of one large bomb and tons of like small bombs in there. And so when it detonates, it basically sprays over a really large field. So unlike sort of a normal mine where you can map them and then perhaps after a war you can go back and figure out where they were planted and remove them, it's impossible to do that with cluster munitions because they just spread so far and wide that you really just have no idea, and hundreds are dropped at a time. So this is something that most countries have really phased out. More than 100 countries signed a declaration phasing out the use of cluster munitions. The United States was not one of them. However, in recent years, the Pentagon have basically said, we're no longer producing them, we're no longer giving them. They did have a stockpile, and that was mainly used, I think, as a deterrent in the DMZ between South Korea and North Korea. And so, but it wasn't sort of actively used in a conflict, so to speak. But since Ukraine has come to fruition over the past 18 months and is desperate for whatever weapons they can get, and the US has to sort of project the image of continuing to support with these very large weapons packages to Ukraine, in the last couple of months, cluster munitions became part of that. And I think for me personally, that's extremely disturbing that we've gone back on our word in using these. And even though Ukrainians are essentially using them on their own soil, these things just have ramifications for decades and decades to come. And I think it's a real stain both, on the US and on anyone else using them. And of course, yes, Russia has been using them, and Ukraine was using them prior to the US giving them. They obtained cluster munitions from Turkey and other places. But I think it really speaks to a very low point of conflict. And just because someone else is doing it doesn't make it right. And I think very disappointed that my tax dollars have been spent to continue to maim people for many decades to come, and I think it's a real setback in the way we approach conflict.
Hmm, okay. Well, yeah, that's the the humanitarian view of it, and I don't think there's any stopping what's happening in Ukraine at this point, but it's kind of taken on its own course. um okay. Next item: Afghan women in 2023. You wrote an article about that. I mean, so like you wrote an update. How dire is it for women in Afghanistan at the moment?
I do think it's incredibly dire. Obviously, I was in Afghanistan in the fall and spent a lot of time there. Went back again. And, in the beginning, there was some hope that things would be different from the Taliban in the 90s, that women would have a lot more opportunities that were presented to them during the occupation. But those are all really, really gone. And women are very much relegated to the home. They're not able to go to universities and to schools after sort of sixth grade. And not able to sort of work in a place where there are male colleagues, and I think it's a real setback. I mean, every week I'm reading about different rights that are taken away from women, and I think that is really disappointing, especially for women that are living in a place like Kabul, which is in the capital. It's a city. It's sort of a lot more exposure to the international roles over the past several decades. And so for women, particularly in those areas, it is extremely debilitating and sad. They can't participate in sports. They're unable to sort of go out and make their own money. And even just kind of functioning day to day, being able to kind of go out and go about your business, subjects you to Taliban scrutiny. And I think it's a real shame what is happening in Afghanistan. And I had hoped that things were different, but I think more and more the Taliban is sort of just proving to itself that it really just has this very stern belief of what gender roles need to be. And these aren't necessarily reflective of Islam. This is very much the Pashtun culture, which the Afghans come from, because, Afghanistan is the only country in the world that continues to ban girls from going to school and women from education. The very Islamic countries do not do that. So this is very much a cultural thing more so than a religious thing. And I do believe that it is not the want of most of the Taliban. In fact, most of the Taliban, when you talk to them, they encourage journalists to write about education and write about other things, because they recognize that as not being right. But it's this very small sort of Kandahari echelon at the top that is imposing these rules, and it's the supreme leader's rules that kind of go without any sort of judgment or pushback. And unfortunately, this is the direction that it's taken.
Yeah, well, not a really good 2023 update then. No, okay. Let's move on to the next article. So you wrote something about the military-industrial complex, and the very core of the article is this mountain of conflicts of interest that you documented in the writing. Tell us, what it is that you really found when taking a re-examination of where things are currently at.
Well, this sort of term, military industrial complex, it's been subject to a lot of conspiracies and a lot of controversy over the years. It actually came during President Eisenhower's farewell address in 1961, and he expressed concern about, ensuring that America remained this very strong democracy, and we needed that, and that he had his own concerns back then about relationships between private entities and the DoD. And I think, as we've seen in the decades that have gone by, particularly with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, really just how uncomfortably cozy that relationship is. And so, on one hand, we certainly do have enemies out there, and taking sort of a utopian look at it, isn't going to sort of serve our national security. And the fact of the matter is that these companies, we rely on them for innovation to create, whatever equipment, whatever ammunitions, whatever vessels, whatever aircraft that the military needs to stay strong. And America really does have to remain vigilant and stay strong against very vast emerging threats in the world. But at the same time, it is a cause for concern, the relationships and the money that is spent. So basically, these private companies, these entities, get our taxpayer dollars from the government, through the Pentagon, to develop these things. But then they have an incentive to continue to want to bolster this profit. And so it really does make you wonder, oftentimes, when threats are overblown, and to what extent America is kind of willing to put all its trust into an entity that is a for-profit entity at the end of the day, and has a bottom line to meet. And I think if we look at anything from Afghanistan and Iraq, just how many companies sort of exploited that and how much money was wasted. And that is money that you and I work hard every day, for our government, that can go to Americans, that can go to healthcare, that can go to other problems within our country, but it is not being spent that way. And so I think it's very fair to look at also the relationship between senators and people in Congress who own shares in these companies, because they also have then incentives to pass laws or to allow, other sort of further military action in places that might not be of the best interest of everyday Americans. So there is a lot of conflict of interest in there, and it is very concerning. As much as we need these companies for their innovation, we also need some sort of transparency and accountability. And mind you can just look at, when the Afghanistan pullout happened, the DoD released a budget not long after that. And it was actually bigger than the times when we were at war, which caused a lot of people to take a step back and think, why? If anything, it should be smaller. But it wasn't. It's grown bigger. And so that should be, cause for concern. And also the DoD, it sort of has a pretty much a blank check. And its budget does go up every year, and it's the only government agency to fail an audit every year, which just shows you that there is no sort of accountability, and that they can spend at will, and that is our money, and that is money that could also be used for many other things and many other important causes in America. And I think it's something that we all should be very aware of, and a lot of the conflicts of interest need to be addressed.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's been a long-standing problem. So, but and one that does need to be revisited from time to time to see where things are. Okay, last item. You wrote an article about the pharmaceutical industry, and the gist of that article is the helplessness of the government in limiting the price gouging that goes on by the pharmaceutical industry that impacts American consumers who require healthcare from increasingly sophisticated and effective medications that are also increasingly out of financial reach. Tell us a little bit about that.
This is a really frustrating topic, I think, because, unlike many other things in life, health is you're playing with life and death here, and pharmaceutical industry in the United States is a full profit industry, and so their concern is not necessarily on the health of the individual, but in making as much money as they can. So basically, the model that exists in the United States is quite unique, to really to anywhere in the world, and that is that these big companies, again, they get large amounts of money that you and I spend as our tax dollars every day, and they get these sort of massive subsidies to then go and create whatever important drug is out. It might need to be out there, but then again, we have these sorts of conflicts of interest where Congress will own, certain members of Congress may own shares in certain companies and be able to sort of push the agenda of what that company wants in. And a lot of it comes down to patenting. So these companies will say, well, we spent X amount of dollars developing this drug. We have to have the exclusive rights on that for a certain period of time before there can be a generic or a much cheaper version come out. But you'll find that these companies will often kind of withhold maybe a drug that might have less side effects or be more effective until that patenting can kind of run out, so then they can maximize their profits to release the next edition of the drug as the old drug, which may not be as effective, is finally going into sort of a generic model that can be a lot more affordable to most people. And so it's really a disturbing and corrupt industry, because on one hand we're financing it, but on the other hand, these companies are sort of getting away with being able to kind of dangle a carrot sort of in front of the health of a lot of Americans. And it's a very deeply problematic and deeply troublesome part of the healthcare industry, that it is so strung on profits, and that drugs can be basically whatever the company that holds this patent, that holds the right to it. And mind you, we need companies developing these things. It's incredibly important, but what good does that do if it's not really saving the lives of Americans? And at the end of the day, majority of the funds often are coming from the people and taxpayer dollars, so these companies often don't have to lay out sort of the vast sums, because they are getting subsidized from the government in many cases, but yet then there's just too many circumstances where I think that they're not serving the people, but serving their own interest in wanting to charge copious amounts of money, when they could be, saving many more lives, if there was sort of a little bit more equilibrium or balance, or the government was able to become a little bit more involved in stopping the price gouging. But the way the model is established, these pharmaceutical companies essentially can't be sued, and there is very limited sort of control that the government can have. And oftentimes it's also because the pharmaceutical industry are massive lobbyists. So they're often paying, huge campaign contributions on both sides of the aisle to curry favor with a lot of politicians. And so politicians are very hesitant to sort of speak out against them because that could mean a huge drop in campaign financing. So the pharmaceutical industry, perhaps even more so than the military industrial complex industry, has such a hold on our politics and on finances, and on what is applicable to get to people who need it and what isn't.
Yes. Yeah. Well, there you go. Okay. Well, so for people viewing this video, there will be links to each of these articles in the description below, and also a link to the Substack page for Hollie McKay, and and this is also an invitation to please consider a paid subscription to Hollie's Substack, so that this kind of investigative journalism and as you just heard, candid assessments of what is going on can continue and thrive. And with that, Hollie, we'd like to thank you for another month of this kind of investigative journalism, and we'll talk to you again next month.
Thank you, Dennis. And yes, thank you for your support. I hope to be able to continue to do the journalism, but it requires a little bit of citizen help. So thank you for your support.